Suriname, a tiny country with a history that reads like a thriller. A nation of people whose ancestors never really wanted to be there. Its story is simply fascinating. A roller coaster of coups, political intrigue, and international scandals are just the surface. From civil war in the jungle to fugitive presidents wanted for cocaine trafficking, you won't be able to look away. And we explore its capital, Paramaribo, to see what life is like there today. This is the spellbinding, scarcely believable story of modern Suriname. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. In the last video, we looked at the origins of Suriname and the incredible story of the Maroon communities, how these escaped slaves were able to establish autonomous communities that won their effective independence from their former colonial masters. These communities survive into the present day, although in recent decades their independence has been eroded as the government has increasingly infringed on their territory. That element is going to be extremely relevant in this video, in which we tell the story of independent Suriname and how it came to be what it is today. The other pieces in this mosaic that we need to fit into place to understand modern Suriname are how, after the abolition of slavery by the Dutch, the massive import of indentured workers from India brought huge numbers of Indians to Suriname, as well as from Indonesia, especially Java. Today, Indo-Surinamese make up around 27% of the population, and Javanese Surinamese 13%. But ethnically, there is one other very important distinction to make. There were, in fact, two groups of people who were descended from people from Africa, the Creoles and the Maroons. The Maroons, now 21% of the population, themselves divided into the autonomous communities that won their freedom, having lived apart for literal centuries in the interior, and didn't feel much common interest with the Creoles, now around 15%, who were descended from slaves that remained mainly on the coast. This is what gives Suriname the shape it has today, with the largest constituent groups being Indo-Surinamese, Maroons, Creoles, and Javanese Surinamese, with smaller numbers of Amerindians and other ethnic groups. So, from being a sugar colony of the Dutch, over the course of the 20th century, the plantations declined in importance as labor costs rose. Meanwhile, the Dutch invested little in their colony. From the 1950s, Suriname began to get more independence from the Netherlands, becoming an autonomous part of the new Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1954, with the Netherlands keeping control of defence and foreign affairs, but with Suriname, as well as the Dutch Antilles, becoming a separate constituent country with its own government and legal system within the kingdom. By the 1960s, the idea of full independence for the colonies had gained almost full support in the Dutch parliament, which increasingly saw them as a fiscal burden. As the Netherlands moved towards granting full independence, there was actually some reluctance on the part of the government of Suriname, with them arguing that it was too hasty and required a bit more, long-term planning. In 1975, however, Suriname became independent, eased with a sizable package of aid from its former colonial power. The new nation had deposits of bauxite, gold, diamonds, oil, and more tropical forest per capita than anywhere else. It was also one of the poorest countries in the entire world. In these few years before and after independence, fearing for the viability of the new country, approximately a third of the population of Suriname immigrated to the Netherlands because they gave passports to anyone who wanted to leave. Businesses closed and millions of dollars left the country, along with most of the university graduates. With such a start, how was tiny Suriname, already not much more than an extractive economy, going to survive on its own? Then, in 1980, the government of Hank Aaron was overthrown in a military coup by 34-year-old Sergeant Major Desi Bouterse. He called it a revolution. He is going to be the main character in this story. Bouterse had been born on a former sugar plantation, and as a young man left to the Netherlands and joined the Dutch military, returning to Suriname just weeks before independence. We took control because we want to save this country from ruin. There needs to be a total change of mentality to transform Suriname into the paradise it used to be, Bouterse said after the coup. He cracked down on the press, burnt books, banned political parties, restricted gatherings, instituted a curfew, and executed political opponents. His government was also fabulously corrupt. They weren't, however, entirely unpopular, at least at first, with many people seeing the civilian government they replaced as also being pretty corrupt. The army, at least, would get things done, but fix Suriname they didn't. Though he didn't start out as a Marxist, Bouterse was soon declaring, "We have stooped long enough beneath the yoke of capitalism." Soon Suriname's only ally was Cuba, and it was broke. There were strikes and power cuts. Then came the events of December 8th, 1982. In Fort Zeelandia on the banks of the Suriname River in the middle of Paramaribo, Bouterse ordered the execution of 15 members of the political opposition, newspaper editors, lawyers, and labor union leaders. These were the December murders, and, shrouded in mystery, they continue to echo through the story of Suriname, as you will see. Suriname would never be the same again. Bouterse claimed they had been shot while attempting to flee. The Dutch and the Americans cut off their aid in protest, a disaster for the small economy. Brazil moved 20,000 troops to the border. By 1985, the country was being kept afloat on the profits of the Colombian cocaine trade. This was the context for the Interior War, or Hinterland War, the Civil War of Suriname. Beginning with the first treaty in 1762, in which the Dutch negotiators had sat across the table from the Maroon leaders and they had drunk each other's blood, the autonomy of the 6 Maroon groups had been recognized. While in 1975, as Suriname prepared for independence, these treaties were much discussed, but they weren't mentioned in either the Declaration of Independence or Suriname's constitution. There was deep distrust between the Creoles on the coast and the Maroons in the interior. But now, with the Suriname government in desperate need of cash, none of these groups had been consulted before logging and mining concessions were granted on their land. Add to that the earlier dam built by the Dutch, built to give power to the Alcoa Company for aluminium smelting, which had flooded Saamaka land. They had been on this land for literal centuries, and now were losing control of it. In 1986, the war began between the National Army of Suriname and a small guerrilla force known as the Jungle Commando, led by a 24-year-old man named Ronnie Brunswijk, or Rombo to his friends, a former bodyguard of Bouterse and an Njuka, one of those Maroon groups. Apparently they had fallen out over money, but soon Brunswijk was demanding rights for the Maroons. Most of the jungles were Njukas, though there were Saamakas and others as well. This would be the Maroons against the national government. They were fighting for the interior of Suriname, and soon the jungles would control an area the size of Wales. They would make decisions by divination and wear amulets into battle to ward off the bullets, with heroin to kill the pain. The jungles attacked economic targets, and the army burnt villages and killed anyone they suspected of supporting the jungles, pulling them off buses or visiting them at night. The jungles were themselves not afraid to do the same, though both sides deny atrocities. It was both brutal and small scale. At one point, Bouterse only had a little over 2,500 men to call on, mostly Creoles. John Gimlet describes how, on Langatalbechi Island, they began worshipping a severed head that had been set on a stake, still wearing its helmet. At a place called Frontline, the warriors would baptize themselves in a large drum of human soup made of body parts and water. In a last fit of rage, the government had bombed the island, with phosphorus crisping anybody left. At Moiwana, the army slaughtered people with machine gun fire from helicopters, then descended to butcher the stragglers with machetes. 39 people, mostly children, were killed. To be clear, these are facts established by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Soldiers of fortune were hired by the Maroons, British, Rhodesians, Belgians, and Afrikaners. Bouterse hired Amerindians and claimed he was one of them. And all this got caught up with the drugs. Suriname had become lawless, and in the heyday of Pablo Escobar, it was a perfect route for Colombian cocaine to pass through on its way to Europe. Then, when Brunswijk and the government negotiated a peace treaty, Bouterse blocked it. The Treaty of Kourou, when it was finally signed, let the Maroons keep what little autonomy they had and integrated the Jungle Commando into the National Army, while Bouterse got to keep control of the country, despite the civilian governments that would follow. It wasn't until around 2000 when he finally lost that informal control. But he was rich, and he would be back. Many of Suriname's indigenous people who had fought for the National Army felt betrayed, as there was little in the treaty for them. This led to another small insurgency starting in 1989, though this soon fractured and a final peace treaty covering all the conflicts was signed in 1992. By the time it would finish, a third of all Suriname's Maroons had fled across the border to Guyana, where they remain to this day. In 2006, after an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights investigation, the Surinamese government apologized to the families of their victims. But the perpetrators remain unpunished, and since the war, the national government has mostly neglected the Maroons, while continuing to grant timber and mining concessions in their territory. The court required Suriname to uphold the 1760 treaties, change its laws, and grant the Saamaka collective title to their land, a landmark decision that applies to all indigenous groups and Maroons in the Americas. In Suriname, however, the government has continued as if the judgment never took place. They propose a road through Maroon territory to connect to the Brazilian highway system. According to Richard and Sally Price in their book on the Saamaka, many observers saw the main effect of the peace agreement that ended the war as to carve the country up into two major zones for drug trafficking. The Civil War shaped Suriname, and its two main characters would continue to dominate its politics right up to the present day. Because the story, if it can, gets even stranger. In fact, as someone that grew up in a country with pretty moderate politics, it's kinda hard to wrap my head around. And yet to actually visit Suriname now, if nobody told you this stuff, you probably would never guess. So with that in mind, it's the beating heart of modern Suriname, the capital, Paramaribo, that we explore now. We arrived in Paramaribo direct from French Guiana, taking a ferry across the Maroni River. We were saying goodbye to Europe and saying hello to Suriname. It was visible fairly quickly that Suriname was somewhat scruffier than French Guiana, which is not surprising as it is a lot poorer. Also evident was the diversity, certainly religiously. It feels like in all the Guianas, the national pastime is taking your caged songbird for a walk. Having been through Guyana, the Amazon, and French Guiana, we were very interested to discover what sort of city Paramaribo was. What did it feel like? Would it feel as unsafe as Georgetown? The answer is that it felt a lot safer than Guyana, and for that reason alone was a lot more pleasant. Suriname has a crime rate roughly half of next door Guyana, with a homicide rate only slightly above the world average. This is the mighty Suriname River, the upper reaches of which we explored in the last video. What you can see in the river is the remains of the Goslar, a German ship that was scuttled during World War II and has been there ever since. Fort Zeelandia, the site of the December murders, is right on the river. Dan and I were travelling with Shilpa from the UK, who we met in the border town between French Guiana and Suriname. She was both the only non-French tourist we met in Guyana and the only non-Dutch tourist we met in Suriname. We didn't meet any other tourists in Guyana. Such is the ignored nature of the Guyanas. Our favourite food in Suriname, and probably all of the Guyanas, was the roti, which seems to have been adopted by all the people of Suriname. Paramaribo has the most obviously colonial legacy of the three capitals, with the centre feeling quite historic. One of the highlights was the signage on the buses, which was top-notch, if occasionally inscrutable. The market is small-scale and similarly scruffy, though I wasn't afraid of getting held up at knife point, like in Guyana.
It says it makes you strong, pemba.
The pale balls you see are called pemba, a sort of edible clay, eaten in Suriname, especially by pregnant women. At the market, there seemed to be a similar representation of Indo- and Afro-Surinamese, as far as I could tell. There was a relaxed vibe about Paramaribo that meant I felt comfortable there. People were a lot friendlier, and there was less of the rampant alcoholism that is omnipresent in Guyana. And maybe with a slightly more diverse demographic, and with the Surinamese of African heritage themselves divided, there is less polarization by race, so people get along better. It seems to me that the Indo-Surinamese presence is a lot more visible in Paramaribo than is the Indo-Guianese in Georgetown. It also felt, though, that there were fewer young people, though I couldn't be sure. Maybe in Suriname there is more of an escape valve to the Netherlands than there is in Guyana. But really, I have no idea why Suriname is less violent and a more pleasant place to be than Guyana, even with a history that resembles it in many ways. As well as a diversity of Hindu temples, Paramaribo is the only place in the world where a mosque and a synagogue are next door to each other, at least according to every single guidebook on Suriname ever written. One afternoon, with Shilpa having left us, Dan and I rent some bikes to go and see what we can find in the countryside. One of the nice things about Suriname's climate is that though an afternoon can turn to heavy rain in a moment, it doesn't take long and soon the sun is shining again. Where the Suriname River meets the Kommerwijne sits Fort New Amsterdam, built by the Dutch almost 300 years ago. The Kommerwijne region was once among the best farmland in the world, designed by the Dutch and made by the hands of several 100,000 African slaves. From above, you can still see the regular grid of irrigation that was built all those centuries ago. Dan's pedal falls off, and thankfully it isn't hard here to find someone friendly to help. We pass the Goslar, still sleeping in the middle of the river. We find an early evening game of football, played by a group of mostly Javanese Surinamese. Trying to end the economic crisis, the ban on political parties was lifted in 1985 and a new constitution approved in 1987, after which new elections were held, with the opposition winning. However, this wasn't full return to civilian rule, and Bouterse, as head of the military, retained much control. He remained untouchable, and his opponents continued to disappear. In 1990, when Bouterse was detained at an airport in the Netherlands on the very same flight as the opposition president, and that same president didn't protest, Bouterse, as head of the military, forced him to resign. It became known as the telephone coup. A year later, however, in 1991, Suriname had fresh elections, which were won by an opposition coalition that included Indo and Javanese Surinamese parties. The new government put in orthodox economic reforms that reduced inflation, stabilized the currency, and re-established relations with the Dutch to resume financial assistance. But the story of Bouterse is only getting started. Because in 1999, Bouterse was convicted, again in absentia, in the Netherlands, to 11 years in prison for trafficking 474 kilograms of cocaine, though he professed his innocence, and he would never serve his time because Suriname had no extradition treaty with the Netherlands. Dutch law enforcement officials claim he was the leader of the Suri cartel, responsible for massive cocaine smuggling into Europe in the 1980s and 1990s. Since 1999, Europol has had an international warrant for his arrest. According to leaked American diplomatic cables, Bouterse remained active in the drug trade until around 2006. In 2007, Suriname's military court started a trial against him for the December murders, the killing of the dissidents back in 1982. Bouterse admitted political responsibility for the killings, but said he hadn't pulled the trigger, though at least one former ally of his claims otherwise. Then in 2010, Bouterse was back as president. His coalition, called the Mega Combination, made an electoral deal with, you'll never guess, Ronnie Brunswijk. More about him in just a second. Instead of denying the past, Bouterse would celebrate it. On inauguration, he honoured the other conspirators in the 1980 coup, awarding them the highest honours in Suriname. He also pardoned his foster son, who was serving time for murdering a Chinese trader and throwing a hand grenade at the house of the Dutch ambassador. The Netherlands, while being careful to say that it would respect Suriname's sovereignty, said that despite being the president of Suriname, Bouterse would not be welcome within its own borders. He was, after all, still wanted for drug trafficking and still had that pesky business of the December murders hanging over him. In 2012, Bouterse's party amended the 1992 amnesty law to include the period of the murders, halting his ongoing trial. The law was condemned by the UN, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And the Netherlands halted their aid once again. In 2015, Bouterse was re-elected for another 5 years, though his spending meant he oversaw a period of rampant inflation and ballooning government debt. He threatened the judges presiding over his own murder trial and banned history books from the country's schools that mention the December murders. To his credit, though, he also introduced universal healthcare, free school meals, a minimum wage, and a national pension. The trial resumed in 2015, but Bouterse, who was still president, declared the trial a threat to national security that needed to be stopped, although it resumed again in 2017. In 2019, the military court arrived at a verdict. Bouterse was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He wasn't there, though, and filed an appeal in absentia. It wasn't until 2021 when Bouterse appeared in court. The charge was upheld, and Bouterse filed another appeal. Indeed, the trial was still ongoing when I visited Paramaribo in 2023.
So in this court, Desi Bouterse is facing trial right now.
Then there's Bouterse's son, Dino, who was convicted in 2005 to 8 years, not only for drug smuggling, but weapons trafficking and luxury vehicle theft as well. He was released early for good behavior, after which he was appointed to a leadership position in the counter-terrorism department. But it gets even crazier, because in 2013, Dino was arrested in Panama by the American DEA while traveling on a diplomatic passport, extradited to New York, and sentenced to 16 years, not only for drug smuggling, but through testimony of 2 undercover agents posing as Mexican narcos, for offering to help the Lebanese militia Hezbollah set up a base in Suriname. Quoting from the DEA's website, Bouterse was also previously charged with using, carrying, and brandishing a rocket launcher during and in relation to the cocaine importation conspiracy. In exchange for a multi-million-dollar payoff, Bouterse agreed to allow large numbers of purported Hezbollah operatives to use Suriname as a permanent base for, among other things, attacks on American targets. He also indicated that he wanted a Hezbollah cell in Suriname to, in part, act as a kind of personal armed force. In addition, in response to a request for surface-to-air missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, Bouterse stated that he would need 2 months and that he would provide a list of what he could supply. The Economist describes how he showed them a kilo of coke and a rocket launcher he happened to have in his office. All this has caused scarcely a ripple in Suriname, whose foreign minister says he expects no upset to relations with the United States. And what had happened to Ronnie Brunswijk after the war? Well, he too wasn't going anywhere. He retired, started a logging company, and a football team. In 2000, a year after Bouterse, he also got a conviction in Holland for trafficking cocaine, and he too has an Interpol arrest warrant against him. He also started a political party, and in 2007 he assaulted a member of Bouterse's party in Parliament, broadcast on live television. In 2021, as boss of his own football club, he broke a world record by making his professional debut in a CONCACAF match against a Honduran team, making him the oldest player to play in a professional match at 60 years old. He then substituted himself for his son. After the match, footage emerged of him paying the opposition players, and both clubs were disqualified from the competition. And at the very time he did that, he was, and still is as I record this at the start of 2025, Vice President of Suriname. Because after 10 years, Bouterse lost the election to, you know who, the party of Ronnie Brunswijk. So where does that leave Suriname today? With Brunswijk as Vice President, the current President, Chan Santoki, inherited from Bouterse a budget deficit of 10% of GDP and an ease of doing business ranking of 162nd in the world. Suriname also has been having ongoing disputes with Guyana, both about what is called the New River Triangle in the south and over their territorial waters. Though not quite as gargantuan as those of its neighbour Guyana, Suriname too has discovered offshore oil, with big finds beginning in 2020. But Suriname remains a poor country. Today, Suriname is the smallest sovereign state in South America, with a population of a little over 600,000 and a GDP per capita of only $5,500 at market exchange rates, though that is over $18,000 when purchasing power is accounted for. In February 2023, protesters against rising living costs stormed the National Assembly. Suriname's ties with the Netherlands remain strong. Today, Dutch is the only official language and is used in education, government, and the media. The only other tourists we met in Suriname were Dutch, and more or less all of its most famous people are footballers who have played for the Dutch national team, including Ruud Gullit, Frank Rijkaard, Edgar Davids, Clarence Seedorf, Patrick Kluivert, Genie Wijnaldum, Virgil van Dijk, and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank. Out of them, Edgar Davids, Clarence Seedorf, and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank were actually born in Suriname. Unlike in neighbouring Guyana, whose political divides almost entirely still fall along ethnic lines, Suriname's are more subtle, mainly reflecting attitudes to Bouterse, who remained popular amongst the poor and working classes. The era of Bouterse, however, is over. His conviction for the December murders was at last and ultimately upheld in December 2023. Then, on Christmas Day 2024, it was announced that Desi Bouterse, aged 79, had passed away. The man who had been president just 4 years before was still in hiding, on the run from the law. His former rival and vice president Ronnie Brunswijk put it best when he wrote on Facebook that Bouterse's life had a lasting impact on our country and his efforts will not be forgotten. You can say that again. We left Paramaribo very early one morning to make it back to Georgetown, Guyana, from where we were flying that night, so returning to where we had started some 6 weeks before. Our journey, entirely overland, had the shape of a rather satisfying circle. And that brings to an end our story of the Guianas. These 3 territories, mostly clinging to the coast with a vast jungle to their backs, have lived a precarious existence for most of their history. Plantations have come and gone, and wars have been fought. Not even so many of the people remain, the ancestors of many of whom came as either slaves or indentured servants. Almost as many people with their origins on South America's wild coast have emigrated to other countries as still live there today. Now, with the discovery of oil in Guyana and Suriname and the space station in French Guiana, it's just possible that their fortunes are going to change. But, for the foreseeable future at least, there will be the sea, and the rivers, and the forest.